Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Business is terrified of what Labour is selling. And one of the things that's really interesting is to listen to how Labour talks. He's talking about Rishi Sunak being dishonest. He's talking about Liz Truss. This is very personal. They have no diagnosis of the fundamental problems of this country. You should be terrified about surrendering your business, the economy, tax to Labour. Absolutely terrified.
So that's the new Conservative Party leader, Kemi Badenoch, speaking in June at Bloomberg's business debate with Labour's Jonathan Reynolds. So we know her position on Labour's policies. What does Badenomics look like? Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. Welcome to the programme.
Now, the Conservative leadership race was announced in July, with, of course, Rishi Sunak stepping down. The sun was shining, days were long, but it's decidedly colder and darker climate that we've seen Kemi Badenoch emerge as the new leader of the opposition and the first black woman to occupy the role. She's been outspoken on a number of issues, but where exactly does she stand on the economy? In her 2 days in post, she's already promised to reverse Labour's planned VAT levy on private school fees. But policy announcements so far have been few and far between.
Well, Stephen, I'd say that's deliberate. Badenoch's focused on the tone rather than the policy, knowing it could be 5 years until the next election. But she has said that her approach to the economy would be completely the opposite to that of Chancellor Rachel Reeves when she was speaking on the broadcast round over the weekend. She did stop short, though, of pledging to block policy, including a hike to national insurance employer contributions. And Labour have immediately put the ball back in her court. They've challenged Kemi to oppose measures that they say will bolster public services. And either way, OBR forecasts for slowing growth below Labour's targeted 2% towards the end of Starmer's term could present the Tories with an opportunity. Badenoch says business is the key, but does she have the answers to unlock a Conservative comeback?
Well, Ray Newton-Smith of the Confederation of British Industry says to do so, Badenoch must play a key role by building political consensus to tackle issues that are holding back investment, such as planning reform, grid connections and more proportionate regulation. I think she'd probably be saying that to whoever is in charge in this country as well, some of the key challenges facing the economy.
Well, let's comb through those challenges now. We have joining us in the studio Kallum Pickering, Chief Economist at Peel Hunt, who's also a Telegraph columnist. Welcome, Kallum. I mean, how much of an economic vision did you have from any of the candidates in this leadership race when we went into it?
You're right, not much, but in a curious way, Badenoch had the least economic vision and actually campaigned on the idea of not putting forward policies. Now, I think the nuance there is important. I don't think it's a question of her thinking that there are different policies, but that actually policy making may be the problem here. So Badenoch often cites Sir Roger Scruton, the Conservative philosopher, the late Roger Scruton, the British philosopher, and Thomas Sowell, the great American economist, who is I think, to put it one way, a disciple of Milton Friedman, really on the libertarian spectrum. Her approach to economic policy, I think, will be that in most cases, the market and individuals voluntarily exchanging goods and services is the best way to solve most problems, and therefore government is a problem, not a solution. I think the reason we haven't had so many policy proposals is because actually I don't think she will be putting many policy proposals forward. I think what she'll try to do here is convince the Conservatives that they need to get out of the way and figure out a way to campaign on that. Now, often we hear this from Conservatives when they go through the policy apparatus and then when they find themselves in government, often it's very difficult. So it's an open question what it will mean.
Well, this idea that government is the problem reminds me of an interview I did with Kemi Badenoch back when she was Trade Secretary and Liz Truss was the Prime Minister. And it was right after the mini-budget. And even then, she was lambasting the Office for Budget Responsibility, which seemed like the most irresponsible thing to do at that moment. And she continues to criticise the institutions of government like the OBR, the Bank of England as well. Do you think that the market would trust a potential Prime Minister with that approach to those institutions?
There's an important point here, which is there are fundamentally two ways to look at an economy. One is to say we have an economic system, in sense we can design it, we can fix this to our benefit, or we say this is actually not a system, it's an adaptation, it's a bit of a mystery, it's a game we all play. And that's really the defining line between an interventionist, the designer, the architect of the economy, and the stand back, get the government out of the way, the market's not perfect, but eventually it tends to figure things out better than policymakers. Now, within that view, there's then a spectrum. The difference between Liz Truss and, I'm going to just go back a little, Margaret Thatcher, was Liz Truss proposed tax cuts, whereas Margaret Thatcher reduced spending and regulation, and then taxes came down afterwards. What Liz Truss essentially did, and what actually conservatives in this country have repeatedly done, is confused Thatcherism for Reaganism. Reaganism is debt finance tax cuts, but you need the dollar to pursue Reaganism. A medium-sized open economy without a reserve currency like the UK needs to get spending down first. And so to get markets on side, I think the UK needs to have a credible plan to reduce the size of the state. And then, if you propose big tax cuts because you just don't need the money, I think then the market wouldn't just swallow it, but actually I think the market might be encouraged by that, given the fact that regulatory barriers are high, the tax system is distortive, and actually in many cases the government is outbidding the private sector by consuming too many resources. Now, this is a long way away before we could see these policies, but it's been very difficult historically to convince not just the people in the UK, but politicians on the political right that this is the right way to approach things, given that people are so disenchanted by the NHS underperformance and challenges with education and infrastructure and the like.
But I suppose this is also perhaps the moment to be thinking in big ideas terms, given that, as you say, Kemi Badenoch is quite a long way away from an election, first of all, and a chance of being in power. Secondly, one of the things that we do know about Kemi Badenoch, though, is that she has promised to slash immigration. I wonder, from an economist's point of view, would you be worrying about the labour market with a pledge like that?
I actually think there's a really important... So to use a phrase that Thomas Sowell, one of Kemi Badenoch's economic idols, uses, is there are no policy solutions, there are only policy trade-offs. The big trade-off that all advanced economies with aging populations face is you can either deal with the economic consequences of an aging population and eventually a shrinking labour force, or you can try to deal with the social and public services consequences of high levels of net immigration, which would promote economic growth. That's the essential choice. Really, that's the essential choice.
Is there a right answer?
On both counts, the answer is better productivity, because if you have a shrinking population, but you can raise productivity, actually you can get some good economic growth and per capita growth. That's essentially what Japan has managed to do. On the other hand, if you would like to have rapid population growth through immigration, you need to make sure that housing, infrastructure, education, healthcare and the like are all growing so that you don't find a situation where individuals feel like there's too much pressure on the system, which then creates political challenges. Actually, I must say we're a little bit front-running the next 4 years when we have this debate, because my hunch is actually we're going to have 4 years of fairly good economic growth in the UK, helped a lot by the investment-oriented fiscal stimulus. And so really the big challenge for Badenoch, we're in the third act here of this debate, is to, after probably 4 years of good economic growth, certainly compared to the last 4 years under the Conservatives, to say, actually, the thing that we need in this country is to get government away, when in fact Labour have proposed getting the government involved, and it will probably result, by luck or by fate, more economic growth. That's going to be very difficult.
Well, that's interesting, and actually that's sort of a relevant question to ask you then, because since we're talking about things being very far in advance, sitting in where we are now at the end of 2024 with the first budget under the belt now for the current government, what is your view of where the UK economy would be by the time an election is due to roll around? What might be difficult or easier for someone who's trying to fight an election campaign?
Well,
I ask you to go very far into the future, I accept.
Of course. No, I suppose that's my job. From the UK's perspective today, it's absolutely true that relative to our potential, we're an economy that's underperforming. I really think if the UK could get its act together and set its economic policy in a way that benefited growth, we could be a 2.5% growth economy. I think our potential growth is probably closer to around 1.7, 1.8. And so there's a huge long-run cost from bad policy making that is baked in.
What is that policy? I mean, Rachel Reeves, said that the summit of her ambition was much more growth. Everybody wants growth. Truss wanted growth, Sunak wanted growth. But seriously, do you have that policy? Because I'm not hearing it from anyone.
Yeah, so I can guess at the framework. So let's take this red herring because I think it's the most interesting. The UK, as with other European economies, is oriented towards a world that no longer exists. Its economic performance depends upon several key pillars which no longer are as strong as they once were. So if you take, say, the 1980s to 2010, trade liberalisation, financial liberalisation, and a huge peace dividend, which stepped up with the end of the Cold War, allowed open economies like the UK to benefit enormously. But the world has changed. We have shifted towards increasing financial regulation after the global financial crisis. Trade liberalisation has gone in the other direction with a concentrated effect because of Brexit, and we're shifting perhaps into a more multipolar world, or at least a world where American hegemony is challenged in a way that America no longer thinks it's to its benefit to pursue trade liberalisation. And this is the US-China problem. Now, in that world, economies like the UK that depend upon imports for things like energy and commodities will be vulnerable to serious supply-side shocks. And that's essentially why, since 2020, we've had American demand growth, but European supply shocks and more inflation than both America and the US. And so it's for policymakers now to accept that the UK is facing a much different global environment, potentially as far as the eye can see. And that's why things like producing more energy than you need is important, to make sure you can supply on your imports in a sustainable way essential commodities and inputs. It's why, for instance, you need to probably, in a world where you would be suffering regular supply shocks, have to have a very credible fiscal policy with respect to things like inflation. And then over time, I think the UK can start to do a little better. We look at ourselves and say, it's a self-inflicted problem that we can't grow 2.5% before. My view is actually the world has changed and we haven't recognised this in the way we set our economy up. If we only could, I think we would then improve.
So if you were advising Kemi Badenoch now, with a long runway to an election, is there a policy area in the economic sphere that you would urge her to focus on?
I would say on energy, infrastructure and housing, if we could just be average in the league of the advanced world, we would see a material improvement in productivity and a material improvement in living standards, and there'd be much less social pressure from a rapidly growing population. And the way to do that as a policymaker is to concentrate your efforts on these things and then accept that in these other areas, the market approach will provide you with an outcome that's indeterminate, but some outcome that tends to be satisfactory. I think that's what Labour are doing, actually. They're choosing the policy levers that they can pull and trying to do something about it. On housing, we've seen progress. On public infrastructure, we've seen progress. But it's essentially just reflect on the fact that the world has changed. And apart from Brexit, most of the reasons that growth is now slower in potential terms is because of things that are out of the UK's hands.
Well, the world could really change tomorrow. We have,
right.
of course, the US election. Do you think that UK trade would be better off with Kemi Badenoch in number 10 if Donald Trump is in the White House?
I think that's hard to say. I think that the UK always benefits from free trade, always benefits, and it's because free trade benefits consumers, not producers. Free trade benefits living standards. One criticism actually I have with the current Labour government, and it's the same I have with Donald Trump and actually Joe Biden, we are pro-business. I really find this misguided. Pro-business is not the way to run an economy. You want a pro-consumer economy. Pro-business is high barriers to entry. It's high levels of regulation that benefit big firms. It's a lack of choice. It's allowing incentives to be created that allow for monopoly power. We want pro-consumer governments. And so when it comes to trade policy, I would be looking to be as free trade as possible in all of the areas that are not a national security interest. And then in those areas, be very, very aggressive. And those areas are things like energy, essential commodities, anything that helps with the net zero transition. And I would just say the CHIPS Act in America is a good way to manage policy in the modern times. You decide what you want to do, you get the financing, and then you orient your trade policy and your regulatory policy to make sure your domestic market can produce this for you. And the reason that America succeeds so much where we often fail is when it faces a supply shock, it deals with the problem. The big problem in 2020 during the pandemic was chips. We have a problem in China, Taiwan, is chips. So America is onboarding its CHIPS Act. Twice in the 1970s, OPEC inflicted a recession upon the US. America within 20 years became energy independent. What we do in the UK and in Europe is when we no longer have security of supply through imports, we try to find someone else to buy something from, which is fine in the world that I described after the 1980s, but it's not fine anymore. And so we have to secure some essential things at home, and then the economy will be better because we'll have insurance policies against the kind of risks you face in this new world.
Okay. Kallum, thank you so much for joining us and giving us so much food for thought at this moment when we're considering change in the leadership at the top of the Conservative Party, but also a pivotal moment in global politics. That's Kallum Pickering, Chief Economist at Peel Hunt. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.